Hello, I'm Sylvester Johnson, the director of the Virginia Tech Center for Humanities, and I want to thank you for joining us for today's Faculty Research Colloquium. I want to give special thanks to Joe Fort, who directs the Athenaeum, which is the digital hub here at Virginia Tech, and to Dominique Francesca, the business manager for the Center for Humanities, for their work in making this event possible. And also a quick reminder that a week from today, on Monday, May 2nd, we will have another faculty research colloquium that will feature the work of Professor Coyne Choi. She'll be talking about her research on social robots and child-robot interaction within the context of musical theater. So hope you will join us for that. Today, we are delighted to have with us Professor Dina Smith-Glavinia. Dr. Smith-Glavinia is an assistant professor in fashion, merchandising, and design in the Department of Apparel, Housing, and Resource Management here at Virginia Tech, and she directs the Oris Glisson Historic Costume and Textile Collection. Her research interests include dress and popular culture, subcultural dress, and reenactment and historic dress. Her most recent scholarship focuses on female science fiction and fantasy fans' dress practices. Dr. Smith-Glavinia also pursues research relating to historic costume and textile exhibition and replication, recreation, and experiential learning pedagogy. And today, she's going to be sharing her work with us on negotiating authenticity, examining the historical recreation and interpretation in reenactment dress. Thanks very much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here.
Thank you. I will share my screen. All right, so I'll just jump in, and just as a note, I will be presenting mainly off of two major papers that I have written, and this pretty much summarizes my stream of research on reenactment dress. In my area, dress doesn't refer to just a one-piece garment. It refers to all aspects of appearance, such as makeup, cosmetics, hairstyles, and clothing. So just so you know, when I refer to dress, I don't always mean just a gown or a one-piece garment. But my research in this area explores the design process of reenactors who create Regency gowns, which so far have happened to be all female reenactors. And if you're unfamiliar with the term reenactor, these are people who, as a hobby, recreate aspects of life of a different time period. This might be military styles and battles and fighting. It could also be parts of arts and culture, such as cooking, camping out, making period homes as far as temporary tents and things. It also entails recreating the dress of the past within specific time periods. So the reenactment group or subset that I've chosen to research are that of the Regency time period. And so this is a time period in England that spans between 1811 and 1820, and it refers to the time in which the Prince Regent sat on the throne in the stead of King George III. However, in popular culture and in reenactments, people reenact what is referred to as the Long Regency, which is the time period that spans between 1795 and 1820. So it's a pretty wide time range at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century. These people, these reenactors that reenact specifically Regency, tend to mostly attend events such as teas, balls, but it also includes festivals, especially those centered on Jane Austen, and events hosted by the Jane Austen Society of North America. Reenactors who wear Regency gowns, well, they wear what is considered historic styles of dress. So these are not necessarily what is referred to as costume, but are just a historic style. And you can see an example in this illustration on the slide of what the typical Regency gown looks like. It has a very high waistline, which is referred to as the empire waistline. Also, often has some gathered back fullness in the back view there. Sometimes they're trained, sometimes they're not. And they are often thought of having some sort of puff sleeves, but then there are also a lot of variety of sleeves within that style. But that's your general picture of what this style of dress looks like. In previous reenactment research. Most of it explored uniforms of military dress among male reenactors. And so a lot of that focuses on Civil War male reenactment. But there have been other works on living historians and other groups. And among all those, there's this strive for authenticity, or a value placed on authenticity. And this is basically a term people use to get as close as reproducing an aspect of the past as possible. So if we're looking at authenticity in dress, then the reenactors are going to strive for having as close as possible version of dress as it would have been in the past. So for my two studies on reenactment dress, I have two very different methods that I used. The first, I'm going to talk about my research as a result of an ethnography. And this is where I examined 23 blog and website entries on the internet to get a feel for the reenactors' design process while creating their Regency gowns, and to basically do a little exploratory research. I continued this research in a follow-up study of qualitative case studies where I interviewed 10 designers or Regency reenactors in depth. And I also observed lots of balls and teas and festivals throughout a good 6-year time period myself, so as a participant observer. And you can see an example of my reenactment dress with the pink umbrella there. So the first study, the purpose was to examine design decisions related to personal needs and the desire for authenticity of reenactors who create Regency gowns. And what I did is I used two models, and I'll get into those in a minute, but overall my results showed that Regency designers wanted to sew authentic gowns, and they wanted those gowns to fulfill personal needs. They also experienced challenges resulting from limitations, and they often negotiated their desire for authenticity with personal needs and limitations. And all this, rather than creating, the result being, rather than creating an authentic gown, it was usually more of a feasible design or a feasible gown. So the results of my research, what came from that was this model that you see here, the Historic Styles of Dress Design Considerations model. And it combines two different previous frameworks. One framework is relating to authenticity. So from Strauss's authenticity continuum, which I'll show later, I extracted the 3 elements of authenticity. And according to Strauss, this included accuracy of construction, methods of construction, and material accuracy. And in my research, I gained a little more insight into actually what those things were. And accuracy in construction really referred to patterning methods. So some of you probably don't know anything about sewing or design. And if you don't, a pattern refers to usually a paper pattern or some type of puzzle piece that you would put together to create a garment. And in order to have an authentic garment in reenactment communities, it's mostly acceptable to take an actual extant garment or a previous garment from the time period and reproduce it exactly. So studying it, measuring it, and creating your own pattern would be probably considered the most authentic method. Methods of construction really refers to sewing methods, whether it's machine sewn versus hand sewn. And the material accuracy refers to the historical accuracy or authenticity of all fabric and all components used in the piece of clothing. This includes buttons, hooks and eyes, the fabric itself, and any decorative trims. All right, and some previous insight into authenticity was that previous researchers have found that materials that are more authentic tend to be more expensive, mainly because the processes used to create those fabrics are no longer around and requires a little bit different technology, and it's difficult to find people who create those fabrics in the same way, and it's very labor intensive and translates to a higher cost. As far as construction goes, in previous research, hand sewing has been exalted as being more authentic, even though in the Civil War time period, Military uniforms were created by early machine sewing. Civil War reenactors tend to exalt hand sewing despite that. So hand sewing garments are generally seen as being more authentic. And what I found from my research that wasn't really, was reflected in previous research, but wasn't as specific, was that the more authentic pattern, the more, to achieve an authentic pattern, you would have to base it on extant garments. And what I found in my research is that reenactors often turn to books like Patterns of Fashion, where patterns have been developed off extant garments in museums. So a lot of study and measuring has gone into that, and it creates patterns that people can use to create their own garments. All right, so in my research, just like in previous research, there was an overarching desire for authenticity, as reenactors often turn to primary and secondary sources of inspiration. So primary sources would be extant garments themselves, like you see here, garments featured in paintings, and also garments shown in fashion illustrations. So if you're not sure what a fashion plate is, it's basically a fashion illustration like the one you see here on the screen. Those are all primary sources. The most authentic or the most exalted being a study of an extant garment, because we know that that garment actually existed at least in one time, whereas dress featured in paintings and fashion plates may not have actually existed, as those could have been altered during the painting process, or the fashion plate in particular was more of a suggested style that women could use to create their garments and may not have reproduced what was seen in the fashion plate to a T. Other Regency reenactors turn to other reenactors' dress for inspiration, and they would often look at websites like Pinterest to see what other people were doing as far as creating their gowns. All right, so another framework that was combined that supports this in previous research was the use of the functional, expressive, and aesthetic consumer needs model. And this is a very well-known design framework for creating clothing, and it basically shows that when a garment is created, it should fulfill certain consumer needs, such as functional needs, the need for fit, it must be comfortable, it must be easily taken on and off or donned and doffed, must allow for mobility. It must be aesthetic, so it has certain colors, patterns, design elements that make it aesthetically pleasing. One important personal need being a flattering or positive body-garment relationship, and then expressive need as well, which expresses one's status or role, and it's usually connected to who they are and their values as well. So more individualistic kind of aspects of identity there. Now, from Strauss's work, I also extracted some limitations, and these were often limitations that were cited by Regency reenactors as well. The two that are most relevant here are the inability to replicate extant garments. This really refers to the skill needed to pattern out and recreate historic styles of dress. Another barrier or limitation to authenticity is financial limitations, which I briefly touched on previously. All right, so ultimately what the first study of blogs showed is that Regency reenactors often negotiate their desire for authenticity. And here's a couple of examples. This blogger, designer, reenactor mentioned that she was unable to find a truly authentic fabric. She wanted something that was more like a wool cashmere shawl that would have been turned into a dress. And this was very common during the Regency period, but she settled for a printed fabric because that was the closest modern alternative that she could find. Another example of a negotiation is between personal needs and authenticity. So there are many cases where reenactors would choose a color that might have not have been worn for a specific occasion because they felt like that color was better for their complexion, or they just liked it more. And another example of this I have later as well. They'll make changes to the design of the garment to make it a little bit more flattering or have a more positive body garment relationship. All right, so a negotiation between limitations and personal needs, even though that did not impact authenticity, was also present. This reenactor mentioned that she had only 8 hours to create a gown, so she was under a huge time crunch, and she was really trying to get the gown looking like one she had seen in a painting or something like that. And it had the original gown had a belt. And when she added the belt, she decided she didn't like it, and she wasn't going to take the time to get it to the point where she liked it. So she decided to disregard the belt altogether. So all these negotiations, again, resulted what is feasible and realistic rather than actually authentic. And here's an example of negotiations or multiple intersections. This reenactor had again, a limitation in materials. Her fabric was actually not wide enough to follow the original pattern for an extant garment, so she had to alter that pattern to get it to fit her and to allow enough fabric to make the dress. She also had to alter her bodice to fit, and that is a personal need according to the FEA Consumer Needs Model. So with those two changes there, or those two negotiations, she resulted in a gown. She created a gown that was feasible, but she also labeled it pretty historically accurate and authentic despite those changes. And what was interesting about these reenactors is that as long as they had one element of authenticity, or one element of authenticity was present, they felt that that was enough. They did not feel like all gowns had to have 3 elements of authenticity. So for example, if they used hand sewing method, they felt like that was good enough for authenticity. If they used a historical pattern but more anachronistic materials, then it was still pretty authentic or had some degree of authenticity. All right, so quickly, I'll go through my second study, and this is the study where I conducted those case studies. I really wanted to look a little bit more into the impact of the elements and barriers to authenticity, specifically interpretive attitude, historical knowledge, and skill, which are ones that we really didn't dive deep into in our first study. And I wanted to see how these impact the level of authenticity achieved in reenactors' gowns and where they could be placed on the authenticity continuum. So this is the authenticity continuum. And as you can see, it is meant to show where a person's dress or their impression lands. However, it is a little bit confusing. As you can see, actual impression, there's some elements of authenticity under dress selection. And you would think that if those are present, it would be more on the higher end of the continuum, and the barriers or the limitations are in the middle, suggesting that someone who experienced these would be on the middle continuum. So it just doesn't really reflect very easily how one's dress could be placed there. The result of my second study was that there were categorical differences among reenactors, and that their authenticity based on their own self-assessments varied widely. However, we could see some similarities in interpretive attitude, historical knowledge, and skill. So based on how reenactors described their gowns, they were categorized as high authenticity, moderate authenticity, and low authenticity. And if you look at this table here, you could see that there's length of time reenacting, similarities and differences. Most of the people who are in the high category have more experience than those in the low category. And I will just actually go through and talk about interpretive attitude, historical knowledge, and skill differences. Obviously, people in the high authenticity category had a very favorable interpretive attitude. They were highly and deeply committed to historical knowledge, and as a result of their experience and time reenacting, they developed a high skill level. Their interpretive attitude was evident in their deep commitment to historical knowledge, and this led to high historical knowledge because they did a lot of their own research. And their interpretive attitude and historical knowledge together guided their selection of materials, patterning, and construction methods. These reenactors in particular often replicated garments from primary sources, whether they were fashion plates or photographs from costume books or photographs from museum websites. Their materials were often very similar to the originals, and they would often even source vintage fabrics that were dating to the later 19th century, but still would have been appropriately used in the early 19th century during the Regency period. These reenactors more often hand sewed and almost always hand sewed their garments, even using the appropriate or same exact type of stitch used in extant garments that they were studying. And as I mentioned before, due to their experience of replicating extant garments, they developed high skill levels, and this developed over time. And you can see in this quote here, Lucy says, "The accuracy is pretty important to me. On the whole, when I'm making costumes, historical authenticity is a huge part of what I do, and my capacity to accomplish that has grown over the last 10 years or so that I've been doing stuff like this." So it supports previous research in that reenactors, the longer they reenact, the more able they are to develop historical knowledge over time and gain the skills needed to replicate extant garments. Now, despite their high levels of authenticity, these participants did experience some limitations. This includes a legitimate lack of historical knowledge. And one reenactor said, "Not being able to handle the original gown and only studying through photographs really makes it difficult to understand what construction methods or sewing stitches were used." And so that can be a legitimate lack of historical knowledge. Another example is from when another participant was trying to reproduce a garment from a fashion plate. Just having an illustration doesn't give a lot of construction information, so it was very challenging. And they had to turn to secondary sources and other sources to piece together the historical knowledge needed to replicate these gowns. And all of them did mention that they still had to alter original patterns for fit. And one reason being, as Georgiana says, most of the patterns have to be measured and resized, and mainly because they are, and she said, "I am not shaped like a Regency woman, haven't worn stays all my life to start, and there are distinct differences between the modern frame versus the woman of that period." If you're not familiar with the term stays, it's usually often interchanged with the term corset, even though they are two different things. But what she's saying here is that she's not automatically shaped like a Regency woman out of the gate. So she does have to make adjustments to the proportion and the pattern to get it to fit a modern shape or frame. And that potentially could reduce the authenticity of the gown. So in previous research on reenactment, there have been attempts to categorize reenactors based on their authenticity. And if we go through that stream, we find that these high authenticity reenactors can be considered hardcore because they do use historical references when completing and sewing their dress, and they do strive towards a complete visible form of authenticity. And they're very intensely committed and have a lot of resources to pursue authenticity. And they often do that with the intent to be very flawless in their historical impression. Now, the next group of reenactors, there were about 2 high authenticity reenactors in that study. There's about 5 moderate authenticity. And these were reenactors that had a moderate interpretive attitude, which I feel like is strongly reflected in this quote. Emma says, "I didn't try to pick an exact copy of a gown that exists and try to match the fabric. Some people will pick a gown and recreate that exact gown. I don't feel like I need to do that." And that was a common sentiment among these moderate authenticity reenactors. This interpretive attitude was really evident through their desire for authenticity, which was often strong, and many of them said it was very important. And because of that, they did do some research and had moderate historical knowledge. There were 2 participants in the subset that were very high in historical knowledge and had a very high skill level, but they just were not very inclined to reproduce a gown from the past to a T. So really, some of them they did vary within this frame of inclination, but those who who cared a lot about authenticity were often limited by their skill set. And so I'll say later on that they were often influenced to take on this moderate interpretive attitude because they felt like they realistically could not achieve authenticity. So all this, their attitude, again, influenced their patterning methods, materials, and the construction that they used. One major difference between high authenticity and moderate authenticity reenactors was their patterning methods. They were very good about avoiding mainstream or widely known costume patterns like the calls or simplicity, because those were not really meant to be created to be authentic. Those were definitely developed for more theater and modern wear type purposes. So these people turned to costume books and used pre-existing patterns, reputable patterns that other reenactors had developed based on their study of extant garments. So these patterns were not created by the reenactor themselves, but had been created by others before them. So this group would really rely on the research of previous people and use pre-existing reputable patterns that were thought or generally believed to be moderately authentic. They also, the moderate authenticity participants also had a good knowledge of what materials were appropriate for the time period. So they were very selective when they were looking for materials. And another major difference between high and moderate reenactors is that they combined machine and hand sewing techniques. And among this group, it was very common to sew major seams by machine, so very long skirt seams that are hidden and interior would be sewn by machine, and anything showing on the outside like buttonholes or embroidery or anything else would be hand sewn. So they were really good about hiding modern construction methods in that sense. And I just love this quote here, and I won't read the whole thing, but I love it when Marianne says, "I don't know if there's a prize that you get for doing it by hand. I don't think anybody's going to say, oh, you sewed that dress by machine." And that really kind of hints at their interpretive attitude, that they're not going to go the extra mile to completely hand sew a gown when no other people are going to really notice. All right. And like I mentioned before, sometimes their limitations and skill influence them to adopt a moderate interpretive attitude. And this reenactor puts it nicely. She said, "It's not really important at this stage because I'm just learning, but in the future, I'll expect more of myself and make it as correct as possible." So this taking a more realistic stance really kind of put them in the middle as far as authenticity goes. Another distinct difference between the high and moderate authenticity participants is that they prioritize personal needs over authenticity more often. So instead of looking at an extant garment that was yellow with silk fabric, they would choose a different color or a different fabric, but use the pattern or the silhouette from that example. So they would exercise a little bit more creativity and be a little bit more concerned with self-expression and personal needs when it came to aesthetics. So they're more of a creative lot. And like the high authenticity reenactors, these reenactors also altered patterns to fit. And one thing that this research revealed was that fit is actually necessary for authenticity. And I actually added fit to the elements of authenticity on my model later. So these moderate authenticity participants in previous research would have been described as between progressive and mainstream, mainly because they seriously considered authenticity, but exercised creativity when choosing color and surface design and embellishments. And they, because they often relied on patterns reputed to be authentic and did not do the research themselves, they could have left themselves open to failures in judgment. So one way to know that 100% that you're being authentic is to study an extant gown yourself, pattern, and sew it exactly the same way. And because they didn't do that, they potentially could be coming off as less authentic and be less, there we go. Be less authentic. So the final category that I found, there were two participants in low authenticity category. These were definitely marked by a low interpretive attitude. They still had a good amount of historical knowledge, so they weren't completely ignorant, and they had moderate skill. But the main difference here was their attitude. So as Eleanor says, it is more important for me to have something that looks like the era or was the essence of the era rather than fully reconstructed history. And this interpretive attitude is evidenced by a lower commitment to research. They're a lot like the moderate authenticity participants because they patterned their garments based on reputable historical patterns that they altered to fit. So they still cared about authenticity, but they would often use materials that were not historically accurate or authentic. So they would prioritize their personal needs or aesthetic needs over that. And that is one main reason they are in this category is their use of less authentic materials. And also they almost always hand sewed and even used sergers, which are very contemporary technologies to construct their gowns. So they used very little hand sewing. One participant in this category was like the moderate, where she did sew main seams and interior seams by machine and then tried her hand at hand sewn buttonholes. But she had also made another gown that was completely machine sewn. Both of these participants had a theater background and they were well versed in newer technologies and favored those because they liked having more time or being able to get things done quickly. These two participants did tend to experience more challenges than others when it came to skill, and that spoke of their moderate skill level and also served as an influence on their interpretive attitude as well. And I mentioned Lydia before with her hand-sewn buttonholes with machine sewing. But I love the part here where she said, I'm not going to go crazy over making this work. Like if the hand-sewn buttonholes don't work out, it's okay. I will go over them with machine. So that's one thing that was evident, that served as evidence of her interpretive attitude. So this example here is an example of prioritizing personal needs over authenticity. This participant said that she chose purple first because it was her favorite color. And even though polka dots are not historically accurate at all, she chose that because she couldn't find any scattered prints, which would have been more authentic, or stripes, and found like she did find some striped fabric, but felt like she would be dressed like a circus tent. So she was very concerned with her pleasant body garment relationship. And that's why she didn't do the traditional Regency white garment as well, because she didn't feel like that was a flattering choice. And if you know anything about Regency or typical Regency, a lot of people go through for a very basic white gown. But she wanted to get away from that in the interest of a pleasing body garment relationship. So she chose the polka dots because it wasn't too terribly off base, but she knew that it wasn't authentic, but she didn't really care. So these last two reenactors can be categorized as mainstream reenactors. And the mark of a mainstream reenactor is that use of less authentic materials. So that's really the one thing that sets them apart. There is a category of reenactor called FARBs, which is a word that stands for far be it from me to criticize your impression. And they did not feel like they were FARBs because they did have a good amount of historical knowledge. They knew what kind of gown was representative of the Regency style. They knew the basic conventions of dress for the period of the event. So they were not historically ignorant, and they were not totally cavalier toward authenticity either. So that's why I've categorized them here in this way. So this second study led to a revision of the conceptual framework presented by Strauss and my own framework. As you can see, the authenticity continuum is here, as well as the historic styles of dress considerations model that I created. And I just combined these two. And what this model shows is that interpretive attitude is highly influential when it comes to the pursuit of authenticity. And when it comes to authenticity, that is a result of negotiations between authenticity, personal needs, and limitations. And I feel this continuum better shows that authenticity is fluid. It could be on the low end or the high end based on the negotiations that take place. So my research has really resulted in the revision of these models. And very quickly, I do plan on continuing the stream of research. I could replicate some previous reenactor studies by having a panel of experienced reenactors rate the authenticity of reenactor dress based on images or video content and have them place the gowns or the garments on the authenticity continuum. But most of all, what I've done with my model development is I feel that either the models, the updated authenticity continuum, or the historic styles of dress consideration models could be used by other researchers, especially when it comes to researching other reenactment groups of different time periods, and even cosplayers. And if you're not familiar with cosplayers, these are people who dress up in costume based on pop culture characters, and authenticity is often a concern for them as well when it comes to portraying a character as being very specific and authentic. So this model could be used to understand that further. All right, so that's my research in a nutshell. Any questions?
So thanks very much. We do have some questions and comments from our audience. And one of these says that Civil War reenactors were prominent in the movie Gettysburg. So the question is asking, are reenactors used as extras in other kinds of movies, perhaps to enhance fashion authenticity in the movie?
That is a good question. And yes, as far as I know, especially in, I think the North and South, the portrayal of the Civil War and that series, they did use reenactors too. Actually, as a reenactor myself, I received a call to be an extra in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And it was just like being an actor. They wanted a headshot, they wanted measurements, and I just thought that was a little too much for me to try to adhere to. So I think it depends on what side of the spectrum the film wants to go, whether they want to treat them more like actors or if they're more like wanting to have a wide range of authentic people present. So the call that I experienced seemed like it was that they wanted to ensure that the reenactors were very much a certain look or way for that particular film. But there are others where it's like, okay, it's an open set, everyone's welcome to join. That's the extent that I know of that, but I know the answer is yes.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. And just a reminder again to our other audience members, you're welcome to send us your comments or questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'd be happy to have those. So another question here asking whether you might say something about the role that TV and movie portrayals have on the research of reenactors, and are those depictions that we witness in TV and movie portrayals considered to be well researched?
That's a good question, and it's often a hot button topic among costume historians. It's really up to the costume designer and the director many times of how authentic they want to be and how much creative license they want to take. So you'll see in a lot of series that there's a lot of creative license. Especially, I know there's the Gilded Age. I tried watching that series and I just saw a lot of cosplay corsets worn on the outside, and that's not authentic at all. So there is this one side of the coin is like these films have this social responsibility to educate people what dress was like. But then there's the other side of the coin. It's like, well, it's just creative and fantasy. And Bridgerton is one of those examples of a Regency fantasy, and the dress is not at all representative of the authenticity. So I think what we see a lot in series and films today is more creative license. But if you go to like the BBC and those types of miniseries, they're more strict on authenticity. So really just, it varies by production. And as far as reenactors taking inspiration from those series and films, they will often reproduce like a spencer or a gown from BBC Pride and Prejudice, but they will also do their own research to ensure the authenticity. So when it comes to authenticity, it is the reenactors' responsibility to ensure that they are being authentic, no matter what the source of inspiration. So I hope I answered that question as fully as I could.
No, thanks for that. So you alluded at one point or a couple of points to some of the historical context for reenactment itself as a phenomenon. This is very common today. I imagine if we went back into the 7th century, people probably were not staging reenactments. I don't know, maybe they were, but clothing. But just in terms of some of the particular genealogies and influences on what we know today and the kinds of reenactments that you've been discussing, can you tell us more about when these reenactments really took shape and when they became a thing, so to speak, and why? What led to their becoming so important to our contemporary culture today?
It's a good question, and you can approach this from many angles. We do see it being a mostly postmodern phenomena. One of the early reenactment groups dates to about the 1960s, and it's really that's when a lot of cultural change and shifts were happening very quickly. And there's this whole idea of, in those really chaotic cultural times, people turn to the past for comfort. So it's this element of nostalgia. So that is kind of what's been theorized has been an explanation for why now. And it's just this, we have such a complex culture, and that we tend to see the past as somewhere that was simpler and made sense. And so people use that to make sense of their lives. There are also some roots in the 19th century with a bunch of romantic painters and the aesthetes that look to the past. So they would create artwork that was more medieval looking and would feature models wearing medieval and Renaissance dress. And so some of those romanticize of the historical roots started there and continued. And so it's this whole idea of romanticizing the past, nostalgia, and it's become more of an obsession as we've continued on our culture. So definitely there's this whole idea of the romanticized view of the past is very, very something that you could see across reenactment groups for sure.
Interesting. Can you also talk about what happens in your teaching? So you've examined your research for us, but of course your department offers a number of courses where students are able to study what is such a fascinating aspect of material culture, from design to understand the historical perspectives on it to exhibition and display. So what are some of the things that you are doing with your students in order to advance their learning about these processes, and how might that look different from a course that is merely, it's not so rooted in material culture, that might be more archival or philosophical, because you're dealing with the kinds of things that you talked with us about today of materials and textures and designs and the sartorial practices, both in terms of their historical and societal context, but also in terms of the literal making of things and the display of things.
Yeah, all good questions. For my history of costume course, I do tend to focus more on the theoretical, the influences, what brought about changes in style. And I try to get the students to understand why these major shifts in dress and style occur. But I also, and I don't heavily focus on this neckline was worn in this sleeve style, because there's a whole lot of history and it can be overwhelming. So, I mean, that's a very traditional view of teaching costume history, is by like, okay, this has a dress, this was a dress that had an empire waistline and all that. But I find it better, or at least more interesting, to really focus on the historical cultural context and what's going on in the culture and what brings about those changes. But I do have activities that do focus on more of the material culture aspect, where I do bring in artifacts from the collection and have them look at the style details and the designs. I even dress in my own reenactment clothing during class so they could see how historical styles would have moved and looked on someone. Even though I do have a modern body and it's not 100% authentic, but I'll tell them that and just to give them a general sense. And that kind of brings some fun and excitement into the classroom, and they can kind of visualize what the historical style would have looked like on a person. Um, so that's one aspect they like, and I enjoy that too, of course. But so I do try to do a balance of recreated designs or historic styles that are not authentic, that have been produced in modern day, and actual artifacts from the past. So I teach using all of those to help illustrate the historical significance behind the designs and the changes in styles.
Great. And what do you find to be one of the more surprising things for students as they're learning about the history of fashion or the present of exhibition or the practices of reenactment? Are there things that are less intuitive for them than others?
They're always surprised when I show them a teeny tiny garment that's an adult garment. They're always surprised with the differences in the body build. And I think it's not always, I mean, there were people of all sizes throughout all history, and there are extant garments that I could fit into. And then there's extant garments for an older woman that looks like it would have fit a baby. And so they are really surprised when they see the artifacts. And that's an opportunity for me to be saying things like, well, you know, in the past, we didn't have all this food production and distribution. They had a lower range of nutrients to choose from. So we're much more well nourished. We have access to more foods, and that's created a huge growth and change. And so they're always surprised by that aspect. Like, and then they sometimes falsely get the sense that people were always tiny and short, which they were not. And they're surprised to learn by looking at a range of artifacts and the sizes that people were all shapes and sizes, and there wasn't one set way of being throughout history. So I think that's just going off their feedback. That's one thing that they've been surprised about. So
Interesting. So, you know, when you were giving your presentation, it was reminding me of the exhibit at the Taubman Museum has Ruth Carter's work. She was a designer for lots of films, but including Wakanda and many others. And one of the things that you were talking about in the history of reenactment, the performance is also related to one of the questions we had earlier, and that is the role of design in film, as well as TV, but basically in media. So it's pretty clear now, given the vast array of media productions that have a historical setting that is period-based, that's not contemporary, that it takes a lot of thoughtfulness and time to make things look convincing, even if it's, you were given the example of Bridgerton, even if it's not precise to the period that's being shown, it's very clear that it's not today. You know, it still feels like it's something that's distant and that was a few centuries ago. And so, of course, all of that relies on skill and talent and people who have to create that material. So can you say something about the way that role of designers and period pieces in media has changed over the decades? There's certainly a lot of it now. So was there a particular point when this was really integral, or became integral to the production of media and the reliance on the skill set? Or did it happen gradually? Were there things that shaped the role of design for media production?
I have a theater friend who's published on the role of historical accuracy in theater, particularly, and she would probably answer your question a lot better than I can, but I'll try. So I mean, as far as I know, in the early 19th century, like if we're talking about films particularly, films were a way to sell fashion. And so when we see like historical dramas produced in the 30s, we see a lot less historical accuracy because that was a new form of fashion communication where they can sell the latest style. So they weren't so much caring about the historical accuracy more than communicating fashion. And then we definitely see that shift toward, as we've moved on, this desire for historical accuracy. And I think it kind of aligns a little bit with that postmodern shift in thinking to where, um, so there's a lot of holes in my answer, but I would imagine to your point of at what point did we see a shift? I definitely think we see more concern with historical accuracy today and recently than we did in the early 20th century. And as far as I'll just comment on the role of theater and historical dramas. There's so many more elements that are impacting the authenticity. So sometimes the director doesn't want it to be set in a historical period, or they'll want the actors to do backflips and that you can't do in historical clothing. So a lot of changes will be made based on what the actors are doing and how they're performing. And then again, how quickly they have to change from scene to scene if you're in theater. So, you'll see Phantom of the Opera corsets with Velcro, just rip them off. And then, so that is actually very different, or not. I see a lot of intersection, and I actually getting with this person to write a paper to convince people there are a lot of similarities between reenactment dress and design for theater and film. But then there are also a lot of differences because in my research, the reenactors are designing for themselves. They're not being dictated by someone else what they can and cannot wear. So it's very much internally driven and by personal choice. And so that's one major difference there. So I could speak more to the reenactment side, having experienced it. But I will say that there are a lot more considerations, and there are a lot of theater costumers that have huge skill sets, but they will admit they're not skilled in historical accuracy or skilled in design and construction. And so a lot of times when total authenticity is desired, they have to spend a lot more money finding highly skilled people to do those costumes. And they have to spend a lot more money to get really authentic materials in order to achieve that. So there are hierarchies and skill even among professional designers who work in the field. And so a lot of times it'll be influenced by the budget.
Yeah. Great. And before we go, I was just curious about the relationship between your experience in reenactment and also your scholarship on sartorial practices, design, and reenactment. Can you tell us how this emerged for you? Which was the chicken or the egg? Does the reenactment experience led to your interest in the scholarship, or vice versa, or did they emerge together, or what?
I'll take you back to high school when I saw the film Ever After with Drew Barrymore for the first time. That really inspired my love for historical fashion. And so I immediately started drawing Italian Renaissance dresses in the margins of my notes while I was in class. And so that's when it was pretty much born, and I decided that I liked this. And then that led me into a medieval and Renaissance reenactment group. It's called the Society of Anachronism, one of a really, really large groups. And they happen to have an annual event that happens real close to my hometown in Mississippi. So I just was fortunate to fall into that. And that was my initial time period of interest was the Renaissance. So I was first exposed to that and got into historical dance and just fell in love with it. And so my stream has been more like the historical dance side, where we dance historical dances and dress in costume to support that. So other people are more interested in the military aspect, the fighting. So so there's a lot of creativity and different streams you can go in reenactment. I also am a Jane Austen fan, so I easily migrated from the Renaissance to 19th century Regency after being a literary fan myself, and just fan of all these historical fiction movies. So the personal stream is I fell into it, I got into it, I loved it, and it was just so natural to research it because I was actually taking a pattern making class at LSU where I was getting my PhD, and I was doing an independent study, and I had to find something to research. So I came up with this idea of ethnography and Regency because I wanted in the class, I was actually studying an extant 1820s gown and patterning out and going through the process myself. So that project inspired that research, and here I am. So it's, yeah, one rabbit hole after another.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, thank you so much for sharing your work with us today. We want to thank all of those who joined us for the talk, and we appreciate your being part of the Faculty Research Colloquium. And again, next week we'll hear from another presenter on the use of social robots in the context of musical theater, Professor Coyne Choi. Thank you so much. We were delighted that you could be with us today. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.